Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Total Biscuit. I'm somewhat back from my surgery adventures. Those of you who don't know, I had a bunch of my liver cut out, plus my gallbladder removed, and that means I've got some rather gnarly wounds right around my abdomen, which has the unfortunate side effect of making breathing in deeply basically impossible due to the pain. So I'm a little bit limited in what I can do. However, the doc has recommended that I start to get back into this slowly because it's going to help my ability to breathe and hopefully get me back up to full speed at some point. So, hey, why not start off with this? It has been quite some time since I've had the distinct displeasure of discussing copyright, YouTube videos, and dodgy developers. You might remember, quite some time ago, back in the annals of history, I was, if not the first, certainly one of the first gaming channels embroiled in a large copyright dispute. Two of them, in fact. The first was for a title called Day One Gary's Incident by a company called Wild Game Studios. They had made the decision to use the YouTube copyright system to take down a critical video that I had made of Day One Gary's Incident after sending me review code for the explicit purpose of critiquing the game in the first place. After a lot of public wrangling and backtracking, plus a video that ended up with over 4 million views, the developer apologized and retracted the copyright claim. Since then, they have done basically nothing. I decided to go looking again and see what exactly Wild Game Studios was up to. Their last real activity on their Facebook page was on March the 13th of 2016, and the only thing they have been doing over the past couple of years is posting a couple of videos claiming that they'd learned to laugh at themselves. Indeed, they would appear to be completely defunct. Even their Wikipedia page got deleted. The only thing remaining is a page on Day One Gary's Incident, which is, for the most part, about the dispute that they had with me. The second incident came shortly after this with a company by the name of Fun Creators. Their title, Guise of the Wolf, an utterly awful game, received fairly similar treatment to Day One Gary's Incident. It was certainly as bad, if not worse, and a lot of what went on there actually went on behind the scenes because we got to the stage of having lawyers involved. Well, I say lawyers, what I mean is lawyer, as in our real lawyer versus their fake lawyer. I would love to share with you some of the conversations that were had because they are absolutely hilarious, but out of respect for my lawyer, I will keep that private. Regardless, the same sort of thing ended up happening and the copyright claim was eventually revoked. This all happened before YouTube had any sort of program in place for dealing with false DMCA claims. This happened before I had any real contacts with YouTube. The only contact I had was indirectly through my network maker studios. This made getting YouTube to act in any way essentially impossible, and the only way that we were able to get those copyright strikes revoked was to force the developers to do so. If you'd like to know what happened to Fun Creators since then, the answer is absolutely nothing. They have been 100% silent on the subject ever since. I have not received a copyright strike since these two incidents. So I've had a few years of none of that nonsense coming my way, and that's certainly very much appreciated, although a lot of that probably comes down to a unwillingness to cover absolutely awful indie titles anymore. I came to the conclusion that while there was certainly comedy in it and people enjoyed watching it, it was something of a disservice considering that Steam was being flooded with titles on a daily basis, some of which were good, and discovery was becoming increasingly difficult. It meant it made more sense to cover either major AAA releases that people actually wanted information on, or titles that were worth a damn in some way. And the last couple of years have been spent attempting to do that to some extent, although, of course, with the medical issues, it's been difficult to keep up. As a result of that, it means that I've been largely insulated from the crazy number of asset flips and utterly awful titles that have flooded Steam over the last couple of years. I've been unwilling to cover them, unwilling to give them the time of day, so there's never really been a situation in which I would have fallen afoul of any of those developers, assuming that they had the balls to go after me in the first place, which, frankly, I find highly unlikely after the Day One Gary's incident and the slapping down that we gave to Fun Creators. However, as it became obvious that the greenlight system was an utterly ineffectual tool to filter out awful video games, Steam has been flooded over the past couple of years with titles that are not even worth a damn. These are titles that, in my eyes, are actually worse than Day One Gary's Incident and Guise of the Wolf. Both of these were games to some extent. They may have used assets that were pre-bought to some degree. We noticed that there were a couple of extremely familiar looking assets in Day One Gary's Incident, but for the most part, both of those games contained a bunch of original work. It wasn't good original work, they were both terrible video games, but in hindsight, compared to some of the absolute tosh that's coming out right now, compared to the asset flipping and the nonsense that came from studios, and I use that term loosely, such as Digital Homicide, Guise of the Wolf and Day One Gary's Incident are practically cult classics. It's incredible to me to see just how low we can go. We've got to a stage where we are releasing games at a prodigious rate that are on the level of Atari 2600 shovelware. They're on the level of the games which directly contributed to the video game crash of the 80s. They are that bad. They are that lacking in any sort of inspiration or originality. There is no developer talent behind them. There is no value to these games at all. They simply exist, for the most part, to mill trading cards, or perhaps in some circumstances to launder money. That's not outside of the realms of possibility. With that, we've also seen a brand new group of developers who are extremely sensitive to both amateur and professional criticism. They go out of their way to remove critical reviews from their Steam page where possible. They go out of their way to ban dissent from their forums, and in some cases even shut them down entirely. In some cases, they go out of their way to blatantly astroturf their own Steam pages to ensure that the ratings and reviews are far higher than they otherwise organically would be, and they have gone after critics on YouTube specifically in order to silence criticism. They've done so using the YouTube copyright system, which is not directly associated with the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, but it is a system that apes it quite closely without any of the pesky legal issues that come from filing false claims. You see, if you file a false claim under the DMCA, you are potentially open to a charge of perjury. That's a fairly big deal, and assuming that actually got to court, it would be rapidly discovered that that were the case. However, the YouTube copyright system is not technically legally binding, so as a result, you have the instant takedown capability of the DMCA without any of the checks and balances that the DMCA, a flawed but admittedly in some cases effective piece of legislation, actually has. This is not a good thing for creators whatsoever. In fact, the whole thing is skewed in favor of the claimant. There are no consequences under the YouTube system for false copyright claims. There are no legal repercussions whatsoever. The system is both easy to use and easy to abuse. It's possible to include false information when filing a claim in the first place, to the point where you're chasing ghosts trying to figure out exactly who put this claim on your video in the first place. It is nonsensical and is in dire need of redesign. In fact, it has been for years now, and YouTube has done very little about it. They have implemented a very limited program by the name of the YouTube Fair Use Protection Program. This is something that covers a very small number of YouTube channels, the most prominent of which is probably Jim Sterling. It should be noted that I am not part of the YouTube Fair Use Protection Program in any way, but that's probably due to the fact that I haven't received a copyright strike in the last 3 years, so I imagine they feel that I don't actually need to be under it. I believe the system also requires you to be the target of an actual false takedown request in the first place in order for YouTube to offer you membership. Now, since I haven't been the target of one, it makes perfect sense that I wouldn't be involved, but if you choose to enroll in said program, YouTube will apparently provide assistance of up to $1 million in legal fees, and they started off with 4 videos that they believe best personify fair use. It should be noted that this particular playlist has not been updated since 2015, so I have no idea what exactly YouTube is doing, or if they were in any way involved with Jim Sterling's recent lawsuit in regards to Digital Homicide. One way or the other, to the best of my knowledge, YouTube has remained in its position of washing its hands of protecting the content creators on its own channel. It wants nothing to do with fair use arbitration, and to some degree I can understand that because, as you may be aware, fair use is not a definitive right, it is an affirmative defense. It is the sort of thing that you bring up during a court proceeding, and the court will rule as to whether or not something is fair use. The thing is, of course, that copyright lawsuits in particular are extremely expensive, and most people do not have the means to fight them, and even if they did, they don't want to, because it's incredibly stressful, and who knows which direction it could end up going in. There is also the very real risk of a precedent being set, that being the concept of case law. When a court makes a ruling, it is possible for that ruling to then be used as a guideline for future cases. In fact, in the case of some of the higher courts, that case law and precedent is legally binding upon the lower courts, meaning that if a lawyer can prove that the case is sufficiently similar to something that's already been ruled upon, the result will therefore be ruled the same. In fact, it's a lawyer's job in many of these cases to disprove that particular fact and sufficiently distinguish the case from a previous case to ensure that the precedent does not apply. Now, really what we could do with in the United States is a precedent on this particular matter. But understandably, nobody really wants to go to court over it, and I don't blame anybody involved. Jim Sterling or anyone else should not have to be the damn test case. They should not have to be the martyr, and they should not be potentially subject to crippling court costs in order to set that precedent. In fact, the company that should be responsible for that is, of course, Google, the ones that have the pockets and, frankly, are in a position where they should be setting that precedent to ensure that less of this kind of nonsense happens on their platform. There is a lot of money being generated by these kind of videos, and YouTube has become perhaps the most important site on the net for critique and product review of any description for any product. It doesn't matter what. Video games are only one of many products that are frequently reviewed and critiqued by trusted channels that have large audiences, and YouTube has for the most part superseded written reviews in many ways when it comes to product review. And that's probably for the best, especially when it comes to visual media like video games. A video can much better represent the product than the written word. However, if this is all sounding familiar, it should, because I said this back in 2013. This is by no means a new concept, and over the last 4 years, YouTube has done very little to advance that particular aspect of their content creator protection, assuming that they even have any aspects of content creator protection in place. Very little other than token programs as far as I can tell. And as a direct result of that, we have seen numerous spurious copyright claims. Jim Sterling just got finished with his lawsuit involving Digital Homicide, a now defunct company who went all the way to attempting a court case on this particular subject. They actually pushed it that far. Other companies have generally not gone as far as this. However, there is a blight of copyright claim nonsense going on when it comes to these awful indie games, for the most part asset flips on Steam, who are looking to silence criticism, who are looking to hide negative coverage of their content. And the thing is that they know YouTube is both influential and very easy to exploit, which is why it's a soft target. You'll notice that you don't see all that many incidents of written reviews being taken down due to a copyright claim. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. One, it's extremely difficult to do so. You would have to actually issue an official DMCA request, and you'd have to do it to the hosting company. They would be the ones responsible for taking down the content. That's already a lot more difficult to do. It requires the filing of actual paperwork. And of course, we get back to that issue that if you happen to file a false one, well, potential perjury charges. Generally not something that you want to deal with. Also, it's pretty damn hard to issue a copyright claim against written work. Much, much harder than it would be against video, which has a stronger argument when it comes to copyright infringement. And this is an ongoing debate. It's something that I've discussed over the past few years. I recall when Phil Fish brought up the issue in regards to Let's Play, claiming that putting up their game on YouTube with commentary was essentially the same as pirating a movie. Of course, I don't agree with that due to the transformative and interactive nature of the video game and the fact that simply by interacting with and playing the video game, you are essentially changing it from its original form. However, there is still a stronger argument to be made when it comes to video work, and also a distinction to be made between critical work, which is generally protected under the fair use doctrine, and non-critical work, i.e. Let's Play. This is generally why Nintendo is allowed to get away with what they're getting away with, coming up with their own official network and taking upwards of 40% of the revenue of anybody that chooses to create videos on their titles on YouTube. They get away with it on the basis that, for the most part, although it has been known to happen from time to time, their automated claims only affect Let's Play videos as opposed to critical videos. This is mostly down to the kind of content that they can automatically match. It usually involves things like music or cutscenes. Generally speaking, neither of these are included in critical videos, so for the most part, reviews tend to get around it, although they have been known to stumble afoul of that policy from time to time. The reality of it, however, is that fair use doctrine exists for a very good reason. When it comes to criticism, it exists to protect independent consumer criticism. It exists to ensure that the copyright system cannot be abused to censor, and I do use that term in this case very literally, critique of a product. It is not a system designed to be used as a hammer to crush those that oppose you. It is designed to be used as a shield to protect your work and property. A grand example of the copyright system being misused has appeared quite recently, and that, again, as with our favorite Jim Sterling, who seems to be a magnet for these sort of things, and it's fairly obvious as to why. He's the most prominent channel that deals in terrible video games. He puts on some rubber gloves and he dives into the shit pile that is Steam's greenlight system. Most of us avoid that. We don't really want to be anywhere near it, we view it as a waste of our time, but Jim Sterling has built his business on the back of it, so one can hardly blame him. As a result, it's logical that he would be the top target for some of these developers, and in this case, the developer of a game called Airport Master has decided to file a trademark dispute. Not a copyright claim, no, they actually directly contacted YouTube claiming that their trademark had been infringed upon. And you might be thinking, well, what the hell is the difference? Well, generally speaking, the difference is that a trademark is used to protect your brand identity. It's used to ensure that your brand identity cannot be traded on, it cannot be profited upon, and that there would be no confusion generated for the consumer between your product and someone else's product who is infringing upon your trademark. That's why trademarks exist, and there are both registered and unregistered trademarks. When you create a piece of original intellectual property, you can also create a mark, and you don't even have to register it to own it. The thing is, there are significant advantages to registering your trademark. It allows you to immediately defend your trademark from misuse, and indeed, to some extent, you are legally required to do so. If you do not defend your registered trademark, there is a risk that the trademark will lapse and become generic, and as a result, you will lose that protection on your brand identity. Regardless of that, though, even if you don't register your trademark, you still have a right to said trademark, and you are able to protect it, assuming that you can prove that you do indeed own said trademark. Now, is any of this sounding like the sort of thing that would cross over in any way, shape, or form with a YouTube video involving criticism of a product? Well, the answer, of course, to that would be no. Of course not. Where the hell could the trademark infringement possibly be coming from? Well, the reality is there is no trademark infringement. As I mentioned earlier, the most common use of the trademark is to prevent brand confusion. What brand confusion could possibly be occurring here? There is no confusion. Jim Sterling is not claiming to own the rights to Airport Master. He is not claiming to be the company behind Airport Master. He is not claiming to be the developer behind Airport Master. He is not representing his video as an official trailer or piece of footage for Airport Master. And he is not claiming that his video is in fact Airport Master the game in its entirety. No, he's not attempting to sell anything. There is no product on sale here. The trademark claim is thoroughly bizarre and completely and totally spurious, which of course is the sort of thing that YouTube should have immediately cottoned onto and rejected whole cloth. But they didn't, did they? Of course not. How foolish of me. No, indeed, they asked the company behind said trademark claim, that being Stickley Games and Jim Sterling, to work it out amongst themselves via email. There's nothing to work out. The claim is flagrantly false. At least with a copyright claim, you have some tiny little stubby leg to stand on. Of course, it's immediately taken out from under you with the Russian leg sweep of fair use, but you had something, you had a kernel of truth there. When it comes to trademark infringement, there isn't any truth. There's nothing to arbitrate here. It's just full-on flat false. Why did Stickley Games go down this route? I assume because the standard copyright claim probably wouldn't stick to somebody like Jim Sterling, who again is protected under said YouTube Fair Use Protection Program. So they went a different route. Not only that, but they used their EULA, as in their end user license agreement, a unilateral contract of sorts that they attempted to impose upon their users to justify this claim. Their EULA specifically states that you cannot create third-party video content of the game without prior written permission from the developer. It also includes some other interesting tidbits, including the idea that you are not entitled to a refund, which apparently overrides various international consumer protection laws, not to mention Steam's very own refund policy. Of course, you can't use a EULA to override any of those things, and indeed, there are very few instances of EULAs being held up in court in any way, shape, or form. Most of these EULAs are, again, unilateral contracts that you have no choice but to sign, and said terms are generally stricken in court when it gets to that point, simply because they are not reasonable. You can sign away certain rights in a contract in certain circumstances. You cannot sign away others, and in the case of a EULA in particular, that is very, very true indeed, and most of these things don't hold up under a judicial microscope. And yet the EULA is still there. It features prominently on the Airport Master Steam page, and the Steam page claims that they require an agreement to a third-party EULA in order to use the product in any respect. This is obviously nonsense. This is, I would hope, going to go away very, very soon, but it will be yet another in a long line of examples. It's the same old story. Indie dev issues strike against someone like Jim Sterling or a smaller channel like Sid Alpha. Said channel makes people aware that this is happening. It blows up all over the internet. There's a huge deluge of negative PR, and in most circumstances, the claim is either rejected by YouTube eventually. Usually takes a long time for that to happen. It can take upwards of a month for a claim to be eventually reversed, and the developer gets a ton of negative press, and the game fails and flounders, which really would have happened regardless of whether or not they had decided to take these ridiculous actions. The word of terrible video games does tend to get out quite easily, and these asset flips only seem to make money off the back of trading cards, more so than anything else. They are sold at very low costs, designed for people to purchase solely for the trading cards, and you would be surprised. There is actually an industry in that. They can be made for almost nothing, and you can actually turn a profit on these things. Unbelievably, you might be thinking, well, surely this is a problem that will solve itself. These games can't possibly be making any money. Well, in some cases they are. If you buy or, in some cases, steal a bunch of pre-made assets, throw them together into some barely functional game and sell it for 99 cents with 3 trading cards included, then a bunch of people will buy it. And it's not all that hard to make money off the back of that if you produce them in large enough quantities. It can be done. It was the entire business model of Digital Homicide before they committed digital suicide. And while Stickley Games are not creating asset flips, instead they're making titles that are extremely poor and have no rights to be published on Steam in their current state, they are just one of many studios that has attempted this very thing and are continuing to attempt these very things. The developer of a game called Fur Fun is a great example, a title that was actually bought by a Spanish-speaking YouTuber of all things, who then did some of the worst VO that I've ever heard in a video game, and this is coming from somebody that did some of the worst VO that you've ever heard in a video game in Space Pirates and Zombies, and then proceeded to abuse, again, the YouTube copyright strike system to bring down critical videos of his terrible video game. That's extra spurious, of course, because he is an actual YouTuber and should be well aware of the kind of damage that these sort of things can do. Regardless, the title Dallas Review, also known as a 10th-rate Spanish-speaking PewDiePie wannabe, and the so-called developer Dallas Games, assuming that they are not the same person, continue to issue claims of copyright infringement, a rather hypocritical act, considering that the so-called game includes music directly stolen from Banjo-Kazooie, as well as an albeit poorly modeled but nonetheless obvious copy of a Disney character, with a lovely little cherry on top in the form of a fake PEGI 3 age rating. Something that they illegally applied to their game, certainly is not applicable considering the use of language in the title, and is a complete misrepresentation considering that PEGI never rated the game in the first place. What a mess. It seems to me like we're seeing a new story in regards to this sort of thing every single week. There is the danger, of course, of fatigue when dealing with this subject, because honestly, this is a very boring topic. It's always been a very boring topic, and the only reason that it garners as much attention as it does is that the developers behind such claims are often emotionally unstable and create a ton of unnecessary online drama. The actual process is clinical, dull, and utterly uninteresting. Copyright claims are not drama. They don't constitute drama, at least they shouldn't, if there were not underlying drama behind them. What would be dangerous is if any of these developers were capable of doing this quietly and doing it competently, and actually had, say, a lawyer to push their case beyond a mere slap fight on YouTube. What's dangerous is when we get into situations such as Matt Hoss versus H3 Productions. That's something that has gone beyond the YouTube form of arbitration, what little there is of it, and to summary judgment, potentially. They are legitimately being sued. Admittedly, Matt Hoss has not a snowball's chance in hell of winning as far as I'm concerned, but regardless of that, they're being sued. That's a real thing that affects people's lives in a real way and has the potential, however small, to completely devastate the lives of these creators. Make no mistake about it, H3 makes a ton of money. They are a very profitable channel, and they have the means to defend themselves. The question is, what happens when a channel does not and becomes the target of this sort of thing? What happens when it isn't Jim Sterling? What happens when it isn't H3? What happens when it isn't me? What happens when those channels are targeted for this kind of copyright abuse? We've actually seen it happen. These channels can disappear. It happened years ago with Sega of Japan, who attempted mass copyright takedowns successfully against 18 YouTube channels, including mine. I was one strike away from having my channel shut down. I have no doubt that I would have got it back because I have the protection of a network and actual lawyers, but those other channels disappeared never to be seen again. Sega of Japan never apologized for this. Sega of Japan never reverted the strikes. Sega of Japan did absolutely nothing to ensure that these channels would be reinstated. Sega of Japan remains under boycott as a direct result of that when it comes to coverage on this channel, and that has been the case for the last few years. As annoying as it is, as boring as it is, this requires consistent vigilance because it will continue to happen. We don't really have much in the way of protection at this point, outside of stomping our feet and making a big noise. That really is about it. The Streisand effect seems to be the only real protection we have, unless it gets to the point of involving actual lawyers. And that is the point where it starts to get expensive. That is the point where you start to get into a situation where the chilling effect could kick in. That's the point that you get to where channels start to get scared of covering these titles. They start to get scared of speaking the truth, of providing honest criticism, because they have no idea whether or not the developer behind that title will decide to swing the copyright system as a giant hammer to crush their fledgling YouTube channel, and they don't have the money to defend themselves from that. They can't do anything about it, essentially. We also have, again, the issue that I discussed earlier of fatigue. People get tired of this sort of thing. They get bored of it. If this sort of thing happens every other week, eventually people will stop caring and they will stop rallying in such numbers. They will stop making as much noise when this sort of thing happens. And unfortunately, that peasant mob strategy, the whole torches and pitchforks thing, is one of the only weapons that these channels have against this sort of abuse. What happens when that goes away? What happens when people get sick of it? What happens when people get bored? Well, trouble is the answer to that. So what is the solution? Is there one? Do we get 30 minutes into a video and say that there is no solution? Well, there is, but it involves certain companies that don't want to lift a finger deciding to lift a finger, or perhaps indeed an entire hand, in order to slap down the people that are responsible for these claims. Back in 2013, I said it had to be YouTube. In the last 4 years, YouTube has shown very little willingness to do that. So the question therefore becomes, is there anybody else that can do something about this? Or are we genuinely going to have to go to court? Are we going to have to get a judgment? Are we going to have to get legal precedent on our side in order to defend against this sort of thing? Well, that's entirely possible. And honestly, I kind of hope it happens sooner rather than later. We could really use this gray area getting cleaned up a little bit. It's too fuzzy, it's too foggy. The law is way too far behind in this respect. We need affirmative rights when it comes to fair use. Not just a defense, not just an affirmative defense. We need an actual set-in-stone right that is clearly defined, both by legislation and by precedent and case law. Until that happens, though, in my eyes, there's only one company that can do something about this. There's only one company that has the power, the reach, and the authority to clamp down on this sort of behavior, and that's not YouTube, it's actually Valve. You may notice that these claims exclusively come from developers that have their game hosted on the Steam service. You don't hear of copyright claims coming from those who have uploaded their games to itch.io. No, you do not. You don't hear of copyright claims coming from companies that have uploaded their games to Xbox Live Indie, although it would not surprise me if that eventually did end up happening. No, the reality is that the companies creating these games, explicitly asset flips, but also in some cases just genuinely bad video games that they believe are far better than they really are making their money on the Steam platform. That's their livelihood, and when it comes to asset flipping, that's their business strategy. Produce quantity over quality and make just enough money off the back of it to flip out the next piece of rubbish onto the platform and continue the cycle ad nauseum. It is possible to kill off this kind of behavior. You have to look at exactly why these developers continue to abuse this copyright claim system. They do it to silence criticism, and to some extent, I imagine, they do it to raise awareness of their title. Now, I've made the argument that any publicity is not, in fact, good publicity, and I've shown evidence of that very thing. It seems odd now in 2017, but back in 2013, I was actually being accused of helping these terrible developers by giving them publicity that they otherwise would not have had, with the argument being that all publicity is good publicity. Well, that's not actually true, and we have proven that simply by looking at Steam Spy and Steam Chart analytics, which prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that this bad publicity does not correlate with increased sales. However, these were for actual video games. These were not for asset flips designed to make a little bit of money off the back of idiots and people that are looking to get cheap trading cards. These were real games. These were people that had genuinely created an actual video game, mostly using their own assets that just so happened to be absolutely awful. And I have to wonder if in the case of asset flips, all publicity could very well be good publicity. Any awareness whatsoever of an asset flip title is probably a good thing. I can't imagine that most of these games are getting sales off the back of looking like a good game. No, they're getting sales off the back of looking like a bad game. They're getting sales off the back of being a cheap way to acquire trading cards to make a few extra cents by those that trade these things almost habitually as a full-time job. That's where they're making their money. And the quality of the game in that respect is utterly irrelevant. Simply awareness that the game and its trading cards exist is perhaps enough. You might be thinking then, based on that logic, that it makes no sense for these developers to take down videos covering the game. Well, it does, if the takedown of that video causes more publicity than leaving it up would. If it causes a larger issue, if it causes the name of that game to get out there and into the ears of more people, there is a larger chance that a few people will pick the title up, even if just to discover how bad it is. And generally speaking, at that price, you probably don't bother with the Steam refund system. It's barely even worth the trouble after you've spent that little money. Quite the bizarre business strategy, but something that is killable. You can destroy it. You can tear it out by the roots, and in fact, that's the only effective way of doing so. And I would propose that Valve go out of its way to shut down the store pages of developers that have been proven to go out of their way to abuse copyright law in order to censor third-party criticism of their game. Now, developers are free to do whatever they want, within Steam's rule set, of course, with their own forum. If they wish to delete criticism, if they wish to delete negative posts from their forum, they have the right to do so. They can. It sucks, it's bad business, but they can do it. What they cannot do is abuse the copyright system to take down videos on a third-party service, and yet they're doing it anyway. Let's make this clear. Just as the developers have the right to delete whatever post they want from the forums, Valve has the right to delete whatever game they want from their service. And it would set a very nice example if Valve were to go out of its way to shut down these developers, remove their games from Steam. They don't have to. This is not Valve's responsibility, by any stretch of the imagination. There are times when I'll blame Valve for certain things. There are times when I will say that it is Valve's responsibility. When it comes to content creation on their service, I do still genuinely believe that Valve has some responsibility to prevent these absolutely awful games from making their way to their platform. To some extent. Valve makes the argument that one man's trash is another man's treasure, but I think there is a line to be drawn. Especially when it comes to games that simply don't work, or games that are using stolen assets, or games that are barely even games to begin with. There is a level of quality control, however slight, that should be applied. However, in this case, Valve is not responsible for the actions of developers on a third-party website. No, they're not. And I'll freely admit that. But if they wish to be, they could. And that would be a very nice goodwill gesture. It would be a great PR move. It would demonstrate to the users of Steam and to those that create third-party content around the platform that Valve has their back and that they're interested in ensuring that that ecosystem continues to remain healthy and prosperous. Bear in mind, of course, that that ecosystem is very, very beneficial indeed. These channels, mine included, consistently reinforce the market position of Steam by simply naming it as the place to get these titles. I idly wonder to myself sometimes how much money I've directly made Valve and how much I've indirectly made Valve through my videos. I would imagine it adds up to quite a bit, but it's in Valve's best interests to ensure that this ecosystem remains healthy. It also sends a powerful message to developers to not mess around on their platform. It's a deterrent. It's the sort of thing that in itself acts as a form of curation. It acts as both direct and indirect quality control, the direct control being the removal of said abusive developers from Steam, and the indirect quality control being in the form of deterrent, saying that if you are going to act in a sketchy way, if you're going to act in an abusive way, then you will not have your Steam page for much longer. It is ensuring better developer behavior. And that is good for everybody, both for Valve, in terms of keeping the quality of their library higher, and in terms of consumers, ensuring that they are not buying terrible video games. While it is not Valve's responsibility to enforce this, by any stretch of the imagination, I do feel that as a business move, it is a good one. Consider this, why would Valve want to be associated with a developer that would abuse copyright law in such a way? Aren't they in some sort of business relationship with said developer? Doesn't it, to some tiny extent, reflect upon them? Would you want to be associated in a business partnership with a company that took such actions? I would say the answer to that would be no. Companies drop partnerships with other companies all the time based on actions that they have taken outside of that relationship. Because yes, it does reflect to some extent upon them, even if they're not directly responsible. The simple question is this: why would you want to do business with crooks? You wouldn't, would you? Perhaps Valve can be the savior in this particular situation. Indeed, I would suggest that they are, at this point, the only company capable of doing so, since Google refuses to lift a finger. Valve, on the other hand, has demonstrated that while the sleeping giant rarely wakes, when it does, it's willing to backhand a fool. And I'd like to see perhaps a little bit more of that. My name has been Total Biscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And hopefully I'll be getting back to regular content at some point over the next week. It's a little exhausting, let's just say, to put together a video at the moment, but I'm gonna have to practice, gonna have to get my lungs back in shape and get over this pain. I can't just be sitting around, it's getting rather dull. I'll see you next time.